Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick and Matthew Bartko here with friends John Breen, Mario Ramos Reyes, and a special guest, Anthony Resnick. We'll begin with the Veni Sancte Spiritus. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Matthew, can you say a bit about our visitor for today? And can you be our guide as we return to the UN Declaration on Human Rights?
Certainly. This month of September, the American Solidarity Party has been focused on labor and how we can support labor rights. And it lines up well in that this is the week that it just so happened to land on Article 23 of the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights. As we've been going through this, we invited Anthony to join us this morning in order to have a more familiar exposure to the labor movement. I myself was in a union, but not for very long, and I felt that our panel could use some depth in this regard. So, Anthony, I'll let you actually go ahead and introduce yourself and mention anything that you think might be relevant to our listeners. Thanks for joining us. And it looks like he may have dropped off the call.
The shock was too much.
We will get him back on here as soon as we can. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead and read the article for us.
Excellent.
Article 23. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. Everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. Everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his interests. And that is certainly a bit of a mouthful. As far as right to work and free choice of employment, let's go ahead and start with Mario and get your thoughts on this first section of Article 23.
Well, when I listen and read this article, come to my mind something that Peter Morin wrote many years ago. And I'm going to read because I think it's very interesting and can somehow introduce us in this topic. He says in one of his articles about teachers, traders, and trickers. He says, politicians used to say, we make prosperity through our wise policies. Businessmen used to say, we make prosperity through our private enterprise. The workers did not seem to have anything to do about the matter. They were either put to work or thrown out of employment. And when unemployment came, the worker had no recourse against the professed makers of prosperity, politicians, and businessmen. I think this short, even I would say sarcastic article showed the need for this article. That everyone in our own human dignity, or based on our own human dignity, have the right to work. And we have the free choice of employment. And with just in favorable condition of work and protection. Now, this is a principle. Now, we may want then to examine what are the conditions of the so-called free choice of employment. What are the conditions that the society have in order for us to be protected? So, again, we run into the reality of concrete political circumstances where the principle must somehow reconcile with the concrete circumstances. And I think that's just a question of history, how this principle is implemented in our daily life.
Thank you, Mario. And I see that Anthony has managed to call back in, and so welcome
Wonderful.
again. And
Thank you.
Anthony, would you go ahead and give us a brief introduction as to who you are, what you do, and just anything else you think might be interested to our listeners as we're talking about the dignity of work and the labor movement this morning?
Yeah, so I'm a union side labor lawyer. I've basically my whole professional working life has been in the labor movement. I started off doing some political organizing with the AFL-CIO, and then went to law school and started out with a firm in the Los Angeles area that represented various labor unions. And then I moved back home to Pittsburgh to take a job in the legal department for the steelworkers.
Thank you. And I know that we were having some technical difficulties. Are you familiar with Article 23?
It's not something I've studied much until sort of looking at it in preparation for this call. I know American labor law and the history of the labor movement here very well, but I'm not as familiar with the sort of international component of things.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we're very glad to have you.
My pleasure.
So the second section of the article is everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. And I'll go ahead and throw this over to Jim and ask, what do you think the ramifications of that are, and what do you think they mean by this in the article?
Can I go back just for a bit to Article 1?
Section 1, sure.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Unless you mean Article 1. You can certainly do that as well.
No, the range isn't that great. Section 1. Our experience on the panel is that we do bounce around some from one part of an article to another. Mario had spoken about the conditions, the background conditions for the application of this article. One that comes to mind is this expression, free choice of employment. For a long time, I've wanted to work for the LA Lakers. In fact, I've wanted to play for them. I see myself as a point guard. Unfortunately, I can't dribble. And so they've never seen that potential in me. And I say this in jest, of course. The free choice of employment depends on, among other things, one's capacity to carry out the job. Of course, what might be meant here is free choice of employment, that is to say, free choice to seek employment in areas that might surprise one's parents or might surprise the people that one grew up with. But we can't take it literally unless we put a number of conditions on it, free choice of employment. And then another bouncing thing here, we have this phrase, everyone has the right to work. Read today, many people might say, hold on, that sounds opposed to unions or opposed to something that unions have often argued for. I guess the term union shop comes to mind. If you're going to enjoy the benefits of union bargaining, you ought to belong to the union. But then when we bounce to number 4, we have everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions, but there's no mention of an obligation to join a trade union. So that whole question has to be worked out when we go to apply these principles. Now, going to number 2, I've got a case study here. Everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. Consider Thomas Aquinas College, Santa Paula, California, one of only 2 colleges to make the cut in the U.S. News and World Report ranking nationwide of the top 50 colleges and or universities. Now, that's an extraordinary development for the college, but here's an interesting thing about the college's approach to equal pay for equal work. It certainly begins with that, equal pay for equal work. But if one family has more children than another family, not adult children, but children that the family is nurturing from the very outset until they can make their way on their own, well, that family receives a higher family salary. And so it would not be equal pay for equal work. And in the tradition of Catholic social thought, a lot of attention has been given to a living wage and, well, living for whom? Not just the isolated worker, but the worker and her or his family. So I think that's another consideration, condition, qualification to introduce.
I'm reminded of Theodore, I think it's Vasilyev, who, with his 2 wives, and in the process of having 16 pairs of twins, managed to have 69 children. I wonder if such
tireless
would attempt to pay him a living wage based on the number of progeny he chose to have.
Prodigious progenizer. Well, I would think that he would be disqualified on other grounds.
Fair enough.
You know, the example is sometimes given of a moral blind alley in which no matter what one does, one has to do something wrong. And a case in point would be the bigamist or the trigamist who promises each family that he'll be with them for the holidays. Won't work.
The third point in the article that everyone who has the right to favorable remuneration that Jim was just talking about I like the way that it ends with the if necessary by other means of social protection. That ties into the Social Security that we were talking about last week. Maybe one of these shows we can talk about an idea that has been batted around of universal basic income. I don't think we have time for that this morning, but it's something I'd surely like to talk about. And then point 4, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his interests. And John, if you could go ahead and touch on that, what do you think that means?
Well, basically that everyone has the right to make up an association or to join an association in the working sphere, but when
John, not to cut you off, but it seems like we're having some technical difficulties on your line.
Sorry.
So we'll come back to you a little bit later.
I'm sorry?
We're getting a lot of chopping on your line. Am I the only one hearing that?
No, I heard that.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll come back to you in a bit, John. So, Anthony, I wanted to get your perspective on Article 23, and in particular, since this is a declaration from the United Nations on how things ought to be and how countries are to strive to be, how do you think the United States is doing right now as far as living up to its commitments in this article?
Well, there are kind of different components about if you're talking about sort of a legal framework or sort of a more normative framework. There's a story that's told about labor law in this country about what a turning point the PATCO strike in the early 1980s was, when Reagan replaced all the air traffic controllers, and the sort of story that's told around that is that even though nothing changed in the law as a result of that action, that it just sort of switched over the attitudes towards unions in this country and sort of emboldened management to take a more aggressively anti-union stance, and that, as the labor movement gets weaker, then its sort of influence starts to wane and people don't see the benefits of it as much and don't care as much about it. So I think we have our labor laws in this country are sort of a mixed bag. They served very well for a manufacturing-based economy. The way that unions are certified under the National Labor Relations Act is it works well when you have a mill or a plant where people know that they're going to have a long-term investment, and so are therefore going to sort of put the risk that comes in organizing a union, because they know that that's, once the union's there, it's going to provide a good livelihood for their, not just them, but for their children and their grandparents, that there's really going to be a payoff into organizing a union there. As that type of economy has faded in this country, we see all of these new kind of more contingent employment relationships, like the gig economy, the use of contractors, the use of temporary employment agencies, the proliferation of independent contractor relationships, where there's a lot of blind spots in our labor laws for that kind of thing. So there are ways in which our laws are antiquated, but there's also ways in which just our entire approach to economics in this country, where far too many people think it as being okay to sort of exploit labor and to get as much out of your workers as you can for as little cost, that's just sort of good business sense and creating value for your shareholders. So I do think there's just our entire attitude towards our economy, I do not see as living up to the spirit of this article.
Fair enough. I want to go around and ask each of you, when it comes to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and for his family an existence worthy of human dignity. Some people say that's why we have a minimum wage, is to try to ensure that, and if that's the case, I find that very pitiable. What exactly do you think would be necessary? And I realize there's going to be fluctuations in cost of living and whatnot, but I'm looking for what are our baseline ideals when we're saying worthy of human dignity? What kind of income, what kind of remuneration are we talking about there? And let's start with Mario.
That is a very difficult question to answer in the abstract. We need to take a look at what concrete situation we are talking about. Living wage by a family living in South America is not the living wage of a family living in Boston. And I think we have to see them. These principles are being applied in very concrete circumstances according to the condition of the place. But let me go back a little bit about how I see the whole, the context of that principle. Back in the late 1940s, when the Declaration of Human Rights were tried to be implemented in Latin America, there were a few intellectuals or leaders who began thinking about forming a trade union and help implement those principles were coming from San Francisco. And one of them, who later became president in Chile, formulated, I think, one of the most interesting proposals then, and I think still is valid or legitimate for us today. Then Eduardo Frei, who later became president of Chile, said once that in order to implement these principles, mainly those who applied to workers and the situation of the peasantry and so on, he said, we need to build a project, establish an initiative of true democracy based on the concept of humanism. Now, right there you have a few concepts, but we need to discuss and go deeply. What is a true democracy and what is humanism? And he goes on, and he went on to say, well, an authentic democracy that expresses the human person in his integrity. And his integrity according to the particular circumstances that we are living in this moment. And then he went on and said, well, what is our situation? Well, we are living in a context where the economic system that people believe is an economic system that only trusts in the fecundity of money. That phrase, this expression of fecundity of money, he was gotten from Maritain. And from that statement, if you will, they sign up a convention and an agreement in 1948 where labor unions, workers, Christian labor union began in Latin America to discuss what are the conditions by which we can really protect human dignity. Now, always when you read the principle of that declaration, which was signed up in Montevideo and in Uruguay, where many people, Christian Democrat and social Christian, got together, they always focus on the family as the source of the first starting point, if you will, of any economic policy. It's not the individual. It's just the family. And the family, they went on and explain, well, there's a family in urban areas, there's a peasant family, and so on. So my answer, perhaps I'm not going to answer concretely, I think we need to examine what circumstances, at what point, and what level of development we're talking about in order to talk about the living wage. And finally, one last point: what is happening today in Argentina as we speak? There is a general strike being called by the unions there, and the general strike being called by the union there, I mean, right now, is because in order to balance the public debt of the state, they are cutting many social programs. And they are somehow following the prescription of the International Monetary Fund. And right now, our people really don't have the basic things to feed their family. And so ultimately, what point out to that is what is democracy? What is a true democracy? And so are we just to focus on some economic financial situation? And so that take us back to what Frey says. In order to discuss the issue, we perhaps need to clarify what a true democracy is. What a really true freedom is, and so that we can examine the condition by which this true freedom to democracy can be achieved.
Certainly a lot to think about there. I know that the line that I was thinking on when I asked the question was, is it in line with human dignity and the spirit of the article to provide such remuneration as a single man could live a single life sustaining himself? Or is it, referencing, supporting a family where you could have a stay-at-home spouse and you could have a number of children or a large number of children? Or is it supposed to be remuneration as such that would allow savings for one to be able to take care of themselves in old age and to be able to buy some of the means of production themselves, to be able to own their own tools and own their own car and own their own home, et cetera, et cetera. There's, I like that it is framing it in worthy of human dignity, as opposed to saying in order to subsist during the period of employment. Let me go ahead back to Anthony and just invite you to weigh in on any of your thoughts on our conversation up to this point.
Yeah, no, I come into this call hoping to have a chance to make a sort of similar point about democracy, because I think when people talk about unions and the benefits of unions, I don't want to undersell how important wages and benefits are to that. That's probably the primary thing that we're that our members want and that we're advocating for. But there also is just a big part of the benefit of a union that's about democracy and having a voice and having a say in how much you want to prioritize vacation time versus wages, how much you want to prioritize job security versus health insurance, and just having a system in place where employees get to have their grievances heard makes a unionized workforce so different from other types, and it also just provides people opportunities to take on leadership roles, to participate in democratic processes through various union committees and offices, and becoming a steward and participating in meetings that are really disappearing in this country as there are fewer and fewer organizations like fraternal organizations that have those kinds of lived democracy in place. So, to circle back to your question, you can't answer the question of what constitutes a living wage in a vacuum of just, it would be this amount per hour or this part of the cost of living plus this level of health insurance. You really have to look at how is the entire economy structured, and is it structured towards one group of people that makes all the decisions and gets to exploit another group of people, or is it something where there's broad participation, where there's a broad say, and where there is this level of democracy that allows you not only to pay your bills, but also to have some voice in your day-to-day working life. Because I don't think you can have human dignity without that.
And John, what are your thoughts?
In regards to the minimum wage versus fair wage, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, minimum wage, given our current currency situation, that it's easy to be manipulated, that a minimum wage is not the answer. So when I hear of political advocates who are championing for a higher minimum wage, it's not, to me, that's counterintuitive, because if you raise the minimum wage, then you're just going to have an inflation of a currency that's already being manipulated. So increasing the minimum wage isn't going to be helping anything. As regards to a fair wage, that's going to require more. It's going to require a lot more thought, because I think it would have to be on almost an individual basis. And when I say individual, I mean the individual worker, taking into account his family, the size of his family, their circumstances, and whatnot. So, and this is a principle that was taken into account with the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum back in, let's see, what year is it? Back in the 1800s. So actually, 1891 to be exact. So when you take it, but when you see situations where you see young people working alongside older people, and I experienced this myself, where I'm a young person, I'm not married, I don't have a family to support, but I'm working along another person who's still raising their grandchildren. They're helping their children raise their own children, and he's making the same amount as I am. So when you look at equal pay for equal work, yeah, that's in place, but the question is that a fair wage as opposed to an equal one?
Interesting. Well, when it comes to the democratization of given venture, is there a place to talk about the strengths and weaknesses and the differences between an out-and-out cooperative employee-owned venture versus one with a healthy union culture? Anthony, I'm going to presume you're biased one direction over the other, but what are your thoughts on that?
No, it's not so much a bias as it is more having more familiarity with the unionized context. But I think there's a lot of promise in a more co-op kind of model, because I think they ultimately serve the same kinds of ends of giving greater ownership over the economy, greater participation in economic life, and the distribution of economic power. So I think there are different industries where different models might make more or less sense. But I think we are really seeing, as union membership declines in this country, again, I think that has a lot to do with just labor law that was written for the 1930s, and now an economy that's very, very different and far more dynamic and globalized, where I'm very much in favor for exploring all kinds of different models that give workers greater control over economic life.
Interesting. Jim, how about you jump in here?
I'm impressed by the rich contributions of Anthony and Mario and the sharp questions of John, I could see a book coming out of our conversation. I'd like to put in a plug for something that's central to the American Solidarity Party, to wit, the common good. When we talk about democracy, I see something that's of paramount importance, and yet nonetheless an instrument, and it's an instrument for our realizing the common good. Now, when we talk about the common good, what I have in mind is the good of the person in community. And human persons are such that there are certain basic goods that are central to human flourishing. And so I see the common good as the actual realization of the goods of the person and the provision of the cultural and material avenues to the realization of those goods. Case in point, it's a fundamental good of the person to be able to have a family. Now, what's necessary for having a family? Well, there are cultural and economic conditions, and I think we're very well aware of the economic conditions, but there are cultural conditions as well. There has to be a respect and a regard for the family. Now, with the common good, there's not this insistence that everyone have, say, an equal income. What's crucial is that everyone have ready access to the goods and the avenues to realize the goods that constitute the broader human good. Now, lest we become lost in such abstractions, I'd like to make one point more that's very particular and then offer 3 case studies. Point particular, number 1, public space is crucial for the common good. Suppose people don't have the housing that would be ideal. Well, if in addition to the housing that they have, that maybe is all the housing that the economy can generate at that point, there are public spaces, parks, libraries, plazas, churches, places of public gatherings such as, well, athletic stadia, and all of that. Public space is an important component of overall quality of life. Now, 3 cases, union cases. Once upon a time when I was a callow youth, 3 or 4 years ago, well, longer than that, I got my first serious picketing, sustained picketing, in a campaign put together by the United Farm Workers. And the focus was no uvas. It was the great boycott. And over the decades, and it's taken decades, the United Farm Workers has come to be a more effective union, and they've realized some fundamental goals that provide basic economic opportunities for farm workers. That's case number 1. Case number 2, in the US of A today, most college instruction is provided by what are called adjunct professors. At the university at which I
Right.
toiled, I was a paper grader of energy, at least for a long time. Well, most of the people there are part-time, and in order to put together anything like a living wage for a family, They have to become what are called Rhodes Scholars. You go from this school where you have one course to that school where you have one course to another school where you have one course. And they really can't put together a decent living unless they're migratory scholars. Now, there's a movement afoot to have them unionized, and in some cases this has succeeded. And in principle, I would be wholeheartedly in favor of unionization, because what they're dealing with are bogus universities that in fact function as institutes to foster a certain kind of economy and not much more. And just to emphasize that, I want to remind people that today in the United States, of full-time undergraduates, 6% only are in the humanities. Where are all the rest? Well, all the rest are in one form or another in technical education. Now, a last specific. My father was, in many ways, an American success story. He began as an office boy for a furniture company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Furniture Land. And he literally worked his way up from office boy to the position of the chief executive officer. And where is all that now? Well, all of that now is in North Carolina or South Carolina. And why is that? Well, according to my dad, the union pushed and pushed and pushed until the business could no longer be competitive on a national basis, and so there was no business at all, which leads to the decision, a decision of great anguish, whether or not workers should pack up and move to North Carolina. Excuse me. Well, of course, that's possible, but it's also destructive in many ways of any sense of local community and a real jeopardy to the family. So those were three cases to put into the mix.
So, Mario, I just want to give you opportunity to wrap up any of the thoughts that you were formulating for us earlier and respond to any of the other comments you've heard so far.
Well, what Jim just said, I'm really relate to, because I have been seeing the phenomenon, if you will, of what I call taxi teachers, adjunct, who go from one class to another, from one school to another, in order to earn some money, which is far from really being a living wage. And somehow that undermines someone's self-esteem, someone's dignity, because the qualification of this teacher is much higher than what these colleges are offering them. And it seems that the market forces are the one there that are working. But that gave me really reflection about something that John Paul II in one of his first encyclicals said or states, which is the socialist Solicitude Res Socialis, about, it was published in 1984, I think, if I remember well, where he said, well, there is a dimension of work which is objective. That means that when we work, we generate an output, a result, some amount of money, but which is important, but this is not really the proper understanding of work, because that somehow is the same as any, I don't know, ideology, material ideology may claim about Marxism or even capitalism, where profit is over the human person in many ways. And he said, well, it's a subjective dimension of work. In other words, when we work doing something, it's not what counts is the output, rather our own being is formed through our own work. The meaning of who we are is being played in our own work, our own vocation. Because everyone has a longing for justice to develop his own vocation. And that longing only can be fulfilled if we belong to something greater than ourselves. And in many ways, that's our place of work. Now, if our place of work is not a place where we can be feel safe and protected and develop our own talent, then we are somehow exploited, or we don't grow in our own dignity. I think this meaning of work, I think, is key in understanding why then we shouldn't have this type of teacher, in this case that Jim mentioned, and go one place to another, and seems that they don't belong to anything, that just go in order to make some money. And I think it's key, should be part of our reflection about the condition of a group of people, and I think that can apply to a different type of work or workers as well. And I have I have experience of that because I belong to a union, the teachers union. In some ways, it's a place not only that these union leaders are defending us about our interests, which is part of it, but also it's a place where you can express your grievances, not only about money, not only about material things, but also about your own humanity. And I think that leads us to what I said before, the true democracy. It's not only a question of money, it's not only a question of salary, it's a question of that we are human and we are here together, and there is a common good. The possibility that everyone can develop his own vocation to its fullest. And I think that is the perspective that we need to pay attention to.
One might go so far as to say that it is necessary for democracy to intervene and restrain capitalism in order to protect our common humanity, to pursue that common good?
I agree with that, yes. I would say yes. Precisely because we are together in this. There is a sense of solidarity among families, among people. Now, having said that, is that the culture of our society today? I'm talking about the United States. Probably not. We are just competing, and our view of what is human is quite materialistic, and the individualism is rampant, and sometimes we miss that we belong to one another, the sense of community. Now, that said, that means that we need somehow to make memory of what are our roots, or is there any other proposal out there that can help us in understanding that? I think we do, and I will go back to precisely the Solidarity Party. Well, the sense of personalism. We are person. We are neither individual or just a mass. Pius XII said precisely, democracy is either democracy of the individual who are competing there, selfish individual, or a mass which is not thinking about anything other than their own self-interest. But we are in the middle of those. We are community of person that emphasize our own individuality, but at the same time belong to a community, in a communion.
Thank you. I think it's a fascinating thing to study, the connection between economy and the history of unions and labor and politics, both in this country and around the world. And I'll throw out there for those who don't know that, what is it one of my friends tells me? He says that communists think that they're the vanguard and the leaders of the labor movement, but the laborers usually never think that. The American Solidarity Party actually takes its inspiration, and a large part of why we're named the Solidarity Party is because of the Polish Solidarity movement, which was a union organizing to throw off the shackles of their communist managers. So let me throw it over to Anthony, who may be a little more on the beat of things these days. I realize the American Solidarity Party hasn't had that many elected officials to influence labor laws yet, but hopefully the platform is supportive in those ways. But it's been my understanding that the unions traditionally favor Democratic candidates. What is the current state of unionism and its influence on politics and politics' influence on it?
Well, it's something that has been, hotly debated within the labor movement about whether we have been getting a return on our investment within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is certainly far more favorable to workers and to unionization than the Republican Party is. But the sort of tensions that you see playing out amongst the kind of Sanders wing and Clinton wing of the Democratic Party about whether the party itself is too corporate friendly and just sort of nominally pro-worker, like those are debates that have been happening within the labor movement for a long time, and it's there's a lot of unions that are in kind of survival mode as unionization has been on a sort of steady decline, and so sort of a lot of these debates come along the lines of, do you stick with the politicians that are going to keep you sort of propped up, or do you start trying to get more creative and aggressive in seeking to reshape the whole economy in a way that could be more pro-labor? So I think there's a lot in politics that are in flux, and you see different unions at various times making different kinds of pledges about how they're going to withdraw more from party politics and sort of just focus on building their own independent political movements. And I think I'm not going to make any kinds of predictions about how that all plays out, but I think it'll be something interesting to watch as there seems to be our entire political alignment seems to be in flux in both parties, and hopefully that creates room for third parties as well.
I think most of us in the Solidarity Party would be not just welcoming, but overjoyed, borderline thrilled to see the might and power that remains in the American labor movement turn toward, abandoning the traditional political system and adopting a more grassroots system, a more democratized system of democracy, if you will.
Say amen, somebody.
So John, I wanted to give you a opportunity to ask any other questions you had for any of our guests or panelists this morning before we get to wrapping up.
Yeah, sure. Dr. Handick made a comment previously about he gave his father's story in the sense that it was the unions that kind of undid themselves in a sense when they tried to negotiate for more than what the employer could give, and they eventually eventually that just killed the furniture business, or at least reduced it substantially in Grand Rapids. So, and I think this is just probably just one instance out of many where the unions they become more of a political entity than anything. And not only do they advocate for more benefits or whatnot, but they're having a strong say in politics. And I have a pretty strong example of that here in my home city here in Joliet, Illinois, where I live in a very strong union city. So, and the thing is too that it seems to me, and I like to throw this out, that the unions have basically lost focus of why they were drawn into existence in the first place, where they were first put up to start to be the vanguard for the working man. But as they become more powerful, they actually fell into the temptations which they initially were there to stand against. So, we had the big fight for the 8-hour workday, but now the unions are endorsing like a 12-hour workday in exchange for more money. So I just kind of want to throw out real quickly: do you guys see this as a happening where the unions are becoming self-defeating?
I'll let Anthony take a swing at that first.
So I don't want to. I both don't want to come off as an apologist, and I also don't want to say anything that could get me in trouble here. But no, I think it's. I don't think that those are questions that can be answered in any sort of broad brush way. I mean, unions are, to me, what makes unions so important is that they are kind of messy democratic institutions. They are maybe not always as much as they should be, but they are sort of bottom up, leadership rising from the shop floor kinds of institutions. And there are a lot of hard decisions that unions face as the economy churns, and employers come into every round of collective bargaining saying, oh, the economy's tanking, our business is in trouble. If we give the wages and benefits you're wanting, it's going to put us out of business. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. And it's unions are constantly facing very hard judgments about when an employer or industry is in financial distress, is how much do you fight for your members and a fair value for their labor, or how much do you try to protect the employer and the industry and keep an employer there for a long time. And there are lots of examples where unions took big concessions and then the companies moved anyway. If it's a matter of being able to move an operation somewhere where you can pay people $1.50 an hour with no benefits, then it doesn't really matter whether the union's asking for $20 or $15 or $25 an hour. Eventually, the company's going to make that decision. So I don't think that kind of characterization of unions it's not entirely false, but it's certainly not entirely true. And I think it's just a result of people having to grapple with very difficult circumstances foisted on them by the economy that we've built.
If I may, I think that one of the primary drivers of that dichotomous relationship is that here in the United States, we have fostered the idea that the union and the corporation are enemies, that they are opposed to one another. Whereas if you look at models like Volkswagen over in Germany, the attitude is much more that they're in business together. They're both working for the prosperity and for the common good of both the corporation and the employees.
Well, and that's kind of built into the law in Germany. But I do think it kind of goes back to the story about the PATCO strike and Reagan busting the PATCO strike, and this idea that there was more of a change in attitude than a change in law. And I have an uncle who worked in labor relations on the management side, and he said just over the course of his career there was this shift in terms of
I'm sorry to cut you off there a little bit,
sure.
but the program's actually about to end.
Sorry.
For those of us listening on air, you can hear the rest of this conversation in the podcast, which will be up. I think Sebastian will probably allow us a few moments of extra talk time on the podcast. But for those who are listening to us on air, I want to give Jim the opportunity to close us with a word of prayer.
Thanks, Matthew. This is a reflection from Father Gerald Van, Order of Preachers, Dominican friar. Think of some very humble and ordinary form of making, like the sewing of a patch on a coat. You can regard it as drudgery and do it with careless or perhaps with savage impatience. And then you turn it into a job. You can regard the patch very differently. You can do it with pride in your workmanship so that it becomes a thing of beauty. Then you are already an artist. You can do it with love and so turn it into lovemaking, and then you are twice an artist. You can do it as an act of worship of God. I patch this coat for this poor child for whom I am forever responsible, as a part of our life together that you have given us and that we turn into worship of you. And then you are 3 times an artist. You are completely alive. And why should not every action that you do be like this? But we are enslaved by a system that despises art and has no room for love and reverence. And so we can be excused if we think that sometimes the end draws near. The soil is stale. Unless there can be a rebirth, our world is doomed. And it must be a rebirth of reverence. Thanks very much. We'll be back next week. Hope you can join us.
For those still listening on the podcast, I did want to give Anthony the opportunity to finish his thoughts and his answer there.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So I was saying my uncle worked in labor relations on the management side for several decades, and over the course of his career saw a shift from, companies having a sort of adversarial but cordial relationship towards unions, towards having a more solely bottom line focused approach to their labor force. And one sort of thing I've heard anecdotally about how companies that we deal with have restructured their labor relations is they've either centralized it in a corporate headquarters rather than having HR people in every facility, or they've they have their HR representatives move from facility to facility on a very frequent basis. And the reason for that is, they don't want the people who are dealing with the employees to know who has kids in college, and they don't want them to know who has a wife, going through chemotherapy. They just want them to look at labor relations as numbers on a page and as a bottom line. And I think that is an indictment of the entire economy that we've built in this country.
I would agree. Thank you very much for being our guest today and for sharing really your wealth of experience and ideas. Thank you to our regular panelists as well, and thank you for those who hung out a little bit after us with the podcast.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.